I'm really excited to introduce Rob Murray. Rob is a former British Army officer. He's currently senior lecturer at Johns Hopkins University and former head of innovation for NATO, which is an exciting and eclectic mix, but very welcome in this innovation environment. Welcome, Rob, to the GIF community.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Ben. And I'll try and bring some energy to the room. I've got the post-lunch sort of slot, so I'll do my best over the next few minutes to do that.
Thanks. So our fireside topic today, imagine this is our warm crackling fire on this autumnal afternoon, is innovation in the public sector. But in terms of breadth and scope, this session is relevant to anyone who is charged with leading innovation in big, complex organisations. And we've certainly had some interesting conversations on that point earlier on. The organisation, NATO, 30 politically independent members. I can imagine the mandate of the innovation team, your team at the time, was a fascinating sort of perspective on creative influence, organisational change, risk-taking, those sorts of challenges. I'd actually like to wind the clock back a bit, start with you. Your resume is, if I may say, anything but conventional. But again, we've heard a number of times this morning that great innovation can bubble up in really interesting places, and sometimes the unconventional route is really interesting. So for the sake of our audience here, could you just tell us a bit about how you got to that role?
Yeah, sure. No, thanks, Ben. So you're right. I think that the path I took was probably a little unconventional. So I am a high school dropout. I left school at 17 in lower sixth, having when I was, quite easily failing my A-levels at the time, and joined the military in the ranks. I actually joined the Royal Air Force. And after a couple of years, and I went to work in the Britain's Permanent Joint Headquarters, which is the operational headquarters for the country, based in Northwood, so just outside of London. And I realised after a couple of years that, funny old thing, a 17-year-old had made a mistake in his life choices, and that I was probably, better suited to a different culture, and perhaps come back to the theme of culture as we carry on talking. And also, I was very fortunate because there were some Army officers there. The place I was working had Army people, had Air Force people, had Navy people, had Royal Marines, and so forth. So I was very lucky as a teenager, quite frankly, to be able to see all of these different types of organisations and where perhaps I best fitted in. I was also very fortunate because there were a couple of very sort of important people in my life then, in terms of military officers I was working for, who saw the potential in me and actually pushed me and gave me the confidence at that time to go ahead and actually go to Sandhurst in the end and become an Army officer. So my pathway into Sandhurst and into the academy was a little unconventional, coming from where I started. And then I stayed in the Army for around about 12 years, went to all of these sort of top 10 holiday destinations that you go to in that profession. I ended up specialising in the world of surveillance and reconnaissance. I got pretty decent at it. I was promoted to the rank of major by I was 29, so I was one of the youngest majors in the Army at that point. And then during all of that, that was that experience. What really sort of taught me how we were able to overcome all sorts of challenges, whether it be, when I was in Northern Ireland as a platoon commander, leading small teams in Bosnia, we went to Afghanistan. It was very much about people. And I know that sounds like a bit of a cliche, I recognise that. But that ability to have a really clear sense of purpose and to actually have very motivated individuals who wish to try to get things done in whatever way they possibly can. And when you're very resource limited, which I would suggest anybody in the British public sector, and today is no different, especially today is no different, is persistently resource constrained, then you have to get creative. You have to think creatively. And so I think what my experiences of the Army in particular showed me was when you have, generally speaking, the military is a sort of representation of society at any one moment in time, in the sort of people that are there and that are joining. And so what does that mean? It means you have a very diverse and very creative pool of people through which to get all sorts of amazing ideas. And so the challenge for me as an officer, not necessarily a challenge, I suppose, one thing I had to remain cognizant of was making sure that I created the right sort of culture for my teams, whereby you could get the best out of the people there. And a rule which I think my first platoon sergeant told me was, boss, if you're the smartest man in the room, you're in the wrong room. And I think that probably has sort of stood me in good stead for the remainder of my career. So that was in the army. Then I left 10 years ago when I had basically a disagreement. The army wanted me to go one way in my career. I wanted to go a different way. And there's normally only one winner in that conversation, and it's not the individual. So I resigned my commission and was then recruited by the Secretary General of NATO to become the head of intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance for the alliance. And then, so that's where I've been for the last 10 years almost in Brussels, working on the political part of NATO. So coming from very much a tactical military world of the army, and then sort of jumping right up into the sphere of geopolitics, which was quite a leap and was, to be honest, the first year or so of that job was very, very difficult, just making that transition.
Before we get into the heartland...
But anyway, I'll pause there. Yeah,
no, before we get into the heartland of that role, I'm interested in those experiences that you've been through, how you've come to conceive of and define innovation, maybe the Army experiences, the NATO experiences, and more recently Johns Hopkins.
Yeah, so I think the way I think about innovation is that you're trying to, at least in my mind, you're trying to create a future that doesn't yet exist. And so that means that you're trying to problem solve, and you have to be constantly adapting. And that's really hard in organizations whereby that puts you in a place where you have to be persistently comfortable with uncertainty and ambiguity. And that is not easy for everybody to kind of wrap their heads around and to engage with. And so it requires, I think, a lot of collaboration as well, because when I think about innovation and the challenges I've had, and we'll perhaps get on to some of the specific examples later, but you're going to make enemies, right, inside organizations. When you want to make a change or propose something or do something new, right, you can guarantee there'll be another part of the business whereby it's going to impact them, and maybe you know it, maybe you don't know it. And so I think not only is innovation about constantly adapting and looking to write a future that doesn't yet exist, but it's also about really having a high degree of resilience, because you have to be comfortable with the fact that you're going to get a lot of hits, a lot of people kind of coming up saying, no, that's not going to work. Here's why, a lot of negativity, and that can be quite demoralizing. So it's not my intent to be demoralizing here, but that's how I think about innovation, and so it has to be a way in which you find that middle ground, you find that path that takes you forward. And it means, I think, for individuals, having quite a high level of EQ and understanding within the company, within the organization, within the firm, okay, how can I bring people along with me? And that is not always easy given the diverse perspectives and perhaps interests that may lie internally.
Okay, cool. So thank you. So let's bring it back to NATO specifically, and it might be worth just spending a moment just reflecting on the organisation, what it's for, how it's structured, but then let's quickly get on to what innovation looks like in that organisation. I mean, the world seems no less safe now, and even the news last night than it has been, at any point in history. So what does innovation look like in an organisation like that? Yeah,
so without wishing to labour the point too much, NATO, founded in 1949, and was very much an organisation created and built to maintain the status quo. So in the bipolar era of the Cold War, you didn't want surprises, right? So if you were there to be predictable as an organisation, as NATO. And so that notion of trying to maintain that status quo and have that predictability is very much baked into the culture of the organisation. And I think, and maybe I didn't sort of hit on this point properly on the previous question, but when we think about innovation, at its heart, innovation is about people and culture. Right? Everything else you can kind of strip away. It's about people and culture. And those two things, absolutely feed off each other. So the alliance, now 30, gusting 32 countries, waiting for Sweden and Finland to be formally joining as members. What does that mean? It means just over 1 billion people, dependent upon the security of the organisation, and an annual budget collectively of over $1 trillion. So these numbers are pretty eye-watering. it was something I felt. I kind of felt the gravity of when I was there in Brussels, whereby the responsibility you have when working in an organisation like this, because whilst the organisation is quite large, and I won't give a very tedious organisational diagram chat or anything like that. The bit I was working in was in the political part and for the Secretary General staff, and basically conducting all the policy and all the negotiations between nations and trying to find that middle ground. And so that's only 250 people covering all the policy for an organisation that has responsibility for 1 billion people. And the last job I had there for the last couple of years was head of innovation for the Alliance. And the scale and the sort of role and responsibility of that organisation does weigh on one's mind. But I think the other element, though, just coming back to the fact I said it was set up in '49, very much about maintaining status quo. What does that mean in today's world? Well, it means that it's really bloody hard to try and get anything changed. Right? It's really difficult to actually try to push new boundaries, whether it be with new technologies, and perhaps we'll come on to that in a moment, or indeed anything else for that matter. Because the way the organisation functions is that all decisions are made by consensus, so by all, in the moment, 30 countries. So therefore, trying to negotiate and find that middle ground between 30 countries when you have as much diversity in terms of geopolitics, from Turkey, perhaps to the United States, perhaps to the Baltic states, to Western Europe countries, UK, France, etc. It's very, very challenging. And so that is often a big part of certainly the role I had, the 10 years in Brussels, was trying to find that middle ground, trying to find, all right, what is the pathway forward? And I think that there's a lot of applicability there for large corporations, large firms, large companies, because what it actually is talking about is, okay, what's the art of the possible? How much can the market bear? And so when you're trying to do perhaps disruptive innovation or any sort of breakthrough innovation type activity, those questions are fundamental. Because if you run too fast and run alone inside the firm, I think that's challenging.
So you've got a pretty complex boardroom, I guess, to bring it back to sort of corporate sort of parlance there. And you touched on the fact, different budgets, different policies, different objectives. I mean, how do you even get everyone in the same room? It's corporate on mega scale, and I guess it's similar to business units and brands and divisions and global regions. How do you actually get everyone in the same room with an agenda that everyone wants to contribute to, that makes sense, and start prioritizing? The innovation priorities is a challenge that sits here universally across the room with such diverse views. How do you even get the agenda to a point where everyone's agreed on the agenda, let alone starting to work through it?
So I'll give you an example. So one of the things which I worked on for the last 3 years, I suppose now, was trying to solve quite a fundamental problem, and that was about defence spending. And so we'll have all seen the headlines, I'm sure, whereby NATO nations need to be able to spend, or should be spending a minimum of 2% of their GDP on defence, right? Now the problem. Now this issue isn't new, right? This issue goes all the way back to Kennedy. When Kennedy was president, and when Kennedy was president, he would come to Brussels. It was Paris back then, and then it moved to Brussels, and basically say, "Come on, Europe, you've got to pay more for your defence." That message repeated all the way through. Obama said the same. This is not a new message. The difference was, of course, in the Trump administration, was that it wasn't clear how vested that administration was to the alliance. And so the message carried more resonance. So the policy goal, was, all right, more financing needed for defence. The strategy to try and make that a reality was basically, Europe, you need to spend more. Right? And this has been going on for decades. And I'm looking at this, I'm thinking, all right, this is nuts. This strategy, it's just abjectly failing, and we don't seem to be doing anything more. So I was doing my MBA at the University of Chicago at the time, and I remember I was sat in a corporate finance class, and I was looking at whatever models they were showing us, I forget. But anyway, And I started to think, oh, hang on a minute, can we not be more creative as to how we use capital markets to try to get at this problem? So in essence, I came up with the idea of why don't we have, this is back in 2017, why don't we have NATO bonds? And you issue NATO bonds, and because war bonds have a really longevity, I think the World War I sort of bonds were only paid off about 10 years ago. It means you can spread these things out at over a very long time. So I spoke to a few friends at JP Morgan and said, what do you think about this? And the idea evolved a little bit, and then it was actually no, we should create what's called a multilateral lending institution. So in other words, a bank. Multilateral lending institutions, World Bank, IMF, European Investment Bank, these were all MLIs. And we'd have a NATO bank. And the idea then, you would have all NATO nations pay a little bit of capital in to get some liquidity, not too much. And then that would give a AAA credit rating. And so what that would mean is for half of the allies in the alliance, their ability to borrow at a much cheaper rate than they can do nationally, because they don't have a AAA rating, suddenly became an option. And suddenly you can repay these loans over huge periods of time. And it meant that you, as a nation, you then wouldn't have to be having to make difficult decisions on where to tax and spend, because actually for your defence you could borrow at cheap rates. Now this was back in 2017. It took about 18 months to do all the financial modelling and all the rest of it, and so the point was we did a ton of analysis of work on this, wrote some fairly, I'd say, preeminent papers on all of this with a lot of data analytics and so forth. And then to your point, how do you get people on the same page? So it's a very long-winded way of coming back to your point. Was like everyone knew this was a problem. All the nations knew this. And everyone could see that it was a real geopolitical problem. And pretty much every nation faced this problem. And even though spending 2% on defence, could benefit from borrowing through this mechanism, and equally those that typically spent that rate also had large national defence industries. And thus, if the pie gets bigger, of course, they would benefit from that anyway. So so once this starts to be explained, I would go round to the different ambassadors in the building and explain all of this. And they could then see, okay, well, they knew the issue already, but okay, here's something quite interesting. Here's something that we could get behind. Now, a lot of the sort of naysayers to this, and there's always going to be naysayers, and it's not, nothing's perfect and fine, was the fact that this was being brought about in 2019, 2020. Right, that's what we do. That was the era of very low interest rates. And so you had a lot of people saying, well, actually, why would we even need this sort of thing? Interest rates are what they are. This is kind of irrelevant. It's not much use. And the bank, the JP Morgan guys, were like, well, hang on a minute. That's not kind of how this works. We will see interest rates go up. It's just a question of when. What this does is creates resilience, and it's a counter-cyclical notion to be able to tax and spend on defence. But the challenge we had was that the people we were dealing with traditionally came from either the Ministry of Defence or the Foreign Office. There weren't any finance people there. And so trying to have this sort of conversation was very, very difficult. And therefore, I kind of acted as that translator coming from the national security world, but also knowing enough to be dangerous from the finance bits as well. But we were able to get everyone on the same page because we had a problem that needed addressing. We had an interesting solution to deal with this. I mean, it went, I briefed the Secretary General's Chief of Staff on all of this. They were very excited about it all. But the reality was the timing was wrong. And that's a key point when we think about innovation, is that being able to have, what could be a great idea, a great initiative, something that's well modeled and could actually have a big impact, if the timing for those external factors isn't right, then it won't go anywhere.
So we've got two quite important points there. First is budget. So there's the 2% ideal, and then there's the mechanism ideally to enable that to happen. Second is the timing. The third dimension then is you can have all the money in the world, but what do you do with it? How do you actually translate that finance, that good intent, into really deployed, targeted creativity with a purpose, innovation in the context of that organisation?
Yeah, so I mean, in this very specific example, it was really easy to be able to know where that money needed to go. Right? There's a again, it's a very tedious process. I won't labour through it, but there's basically a shopping list that every nation is given by NATO in terms of, right, here's what you need to bring to the party, tanks, jets, submarines, whatever. Not everybody is able to fulfil that shopping list. So it's very clear where that money needs to go in terms of the here and now. I think the more interesting part is, okay, where do we go in the future? And so that led us to a significant piece of work on NATO's emerging and disruptive technologies. And again, when I was the head of innovation, I had a very small team. We started off with 3 of us. I think by the time I left, we were up to about 9. And just as an aside, the reason we were able to be relatively effective was because we sat right at the top of the tree. So we had access into the sort of Secretary General's office and had his mandate, if you will. And I think that's a really important point for any innovation teams, is that if you're buried deep in the organization, it's very difficult to make that change. Not because you don't have bright ideas and aspiration and so forth, but because you need a little bit of CEO push and a little bit of a mandate which has to be acknowledged across the organization. So coming back to how do we prioritize? We were fortunate where we were kind of sat. And so what that allowed us to do was actually have that sort of convening power to pull together lots of global experts on new technologies and find that consensus as to, okay, where do we need to go? And so what does that mean? It means that, for our shareholders, i.e. nations, they're able to be part of that process and see that, okay, these aren't just random ideas about focusing on autonomy or artificial intelligence or quantum or whatever it might be. Actually, no, this is very well thought through and there's a logic to this work. And actually, they've been part of it as well. So that then led to, prioritizing from a very vast array of new technologies down to a very small list of about 7, and a number of activities that fell out from that. But it was bringing everybody along in that. I was going to say journey. It's a bit of a cheesy word, but yeah, in that process, in that journey, and the trade-off there though is time. It takes time to do that. And so there's a sort of desire to get things done relatively quickly, but in that sort of environment, you're not going to go very far. And so you have to have that trade-off.
So you've got the budget, you've got leadership buy-in, you've aligned on the priority themes. It strikes me that the relationship with governments and defence spending has probably changed over time as well. And I know you had quite an impact on driving what I suppose in these sorts of environments we'd call open innovation, so that relationship with the private sector. How, in this challenging conceptual world of private sector investment, confidentiality, security, do you bring the private sector in to drive more of the agenda?
So I think a couple of things. So first of all, we need to understand that in the 20th century, the public sector really did drive a lot of technology innovation. So specifically through American agencies like DARPA, Defense Advanced Research Program Agency. The fact we have GPS today, the internet, speech recognition, touchscreen. These are all things that came from public money research. Now, of course, it took time and years to commercialize those. Of course it did. But the core money was from the public sector. That's changed now. The private sector is the driver of that core money. And the incentives are different. And so what does that mean? It means that we need to understand the flavor of money in terms of the public sector and the private sector. And what the public sector can do is it can't just take risks. It can go beyond that and dive into the pool of uncertainty. Because most countries tend not to go bust. Although, I guess the former Prime Minister made a good effort of changing that. But anyway.
Move on.
So the point being is that you can take those big uncertain challenges because you haven't got perhaps shareholder pressure, perhaps the need, if you're a venture capital firm or a startup raising VC funds, the need to have an exit in 4 years or whatever it might be. And so understanding, I think, the roles of money and the different flavors of money from public and private and where they complement one another. And that, to me, is a missing piece in this discussion. And I think what we're going to see, and I think through necessity, quite frankly, what we're going to see is a greater sort of reboot, if you will, of public-private partnerships. And that may sound a little old-fashioned, but I suspect in many countries, given broader economic conditions, I think we're going to see that happen. And we're starting to see the sort of green shoots of that, I would suggest, in this country.
Interesting. And a topic that's already come up a number of times today has been AI. Where does AI figure in this? We're talking about global security, global defence budgets, private sector. Where does AI bubble up in all of this?
So the way I think about this is you can't really have an effective sort of defence structure if that's not really aligned with government, broader bits and pieces, and also society. So we've got these three different groupings. Society is becoming accustomed to AI, whether people know it or not. Every time you go on Netflix, every time you shop on Amazon, there's algorithms running it. So society is becoming accustomed to this. And therefore, there's an expectation that our defence and security apparatus is also using similar sorts of technologies in some way, shape or form, I would suggest. But B, that also has to be done adhering to our values, our principles, what's important to us. And so one of the bits of work that I did at NATO before I left, we wrote the world's first AI strategy where we got governments to agree to it and put in place critically principles of responsible use when we think about algorithms and how they might be used in a defense and security landscape. And that's about governability, it's about transparency, just fundamentally understanding what's going on and not just having a black box. And it's a little bit more than that, but that's kind of the core message. So AI is here, it's here to stay. And so again, we need to think, all right, how do we best leverage this given who we are, our values and what's important to us? And that needs and means rather that from the government part of that sort of triumvirate, they've got to be technologically competent, right? They don't have to be data scientists, but they have to have a degree of understanding as to what this technology means and, broadly the implications of it. And what I see at the moment is our political class writ large, not just the UK, is not where perhaps it should be, given the technological change and challenge that we're seeing.
Great. I do want to have a couple of minutes for questions, so I'll let the audience think of any that might be bubbling up right now. But really, as we bring it to a close, maybe there's a lot of similarities, I think, as we've discussed, and when we chatted before this with the corporate world, big complex organisations, and your own learnings. I wonder if you were to kind of summarise 2 or 3 of the most important things that you've learned within your touch points within an innovation ecosystem, maybe from the front line, within NATO and beyond.
Yeah, sure. Well, look, very briefly, it's all about people, right? This is a people sport. It's all about creating the culture and the conditions whereby you can get the best out of people and actually you can create that sort of psychological safety for new ideas, new thinking. And part of that is having diverse teams, and not just diverse in terms of sort of gender and perhaps race, but also, and I would say this, I have a bias here, education diversity. Like I say, I have no A-levels, I have no undergraduate degree. The fact I'm a professor at Johns Hopkins kind of blows my students' minds, but nonetheless, it creates different perspectives, different perceptions. And so I think for organizations, one really needs to look at, job descriptions. Do we want a sort of homogeneity of everyone having degrees for X, Y, Z? This is about people and getting the best out of people, which means you need to have that sort of diversity of experiences.
Great point to round up on. Rob Murray, thank you so much for sharing your insight today.
Thanks.